everyone, I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. Today's lecture is part of the ongoing series on the 20th century English poetry, and the lecture is titled Wallace Stevens, the Modernist Poet. Now, you might be wondering that, some of you might have also heard about Wallace Stevens, but those of you who are familiar a bit with, American literature would immediately be able to place Wallace Stevens as one of the seminal poets of the 20th century American modernism. Now, you must be wondering that we are doing 20th century English poetry, but here we are talking about an American poet. But as we've also emphasized in the previous lectures too, that when we talk about English or when we say English poetry, we mean poetry written, of course, foremost in England by the British poet, by British poets, or for that matter even Irish poets, and also poetry written in English language per se. Right. So, today's lecture then will explore Wallace Stevens as the modernist poet. We will also discuss his biological and intellectual background, and also we will try to understand that where does Wallace Stevens stand in this larger trend of the American modernism, and we are going to tie all these points together with the discussion of one of the very famous poems by this poet that is titled The Snowman. Right. So, let's understand what exactly first are the dates of Wallace Stevens. So, he was born in 1879 and was around till 1955, and he was born at this place called Reading in Pennsylvania, USA. Now, you see, by education, Wallace Stevens was a lawyer, and he moved to New York soon after he graduated from Harvard University. Over there in New York, he attended the New York Law School and also worked for a few years in a few law firms as well. And then, having worked for a while in the law industry, he then moved to the insurance sector and occupied a high position in a company of repute in this industry. Right. So, now adopting these ways of earning or a livelihood, Stephens actually wrote poems at night. Right. So, by the day he was the usual individual who was working in these big companies for his livelihood, and it was towards the end of the day that he would write poems. Right. So, in fact, I would say that this might also inspire quite a lot of us to also write our own poetry as well, no matter whatever we might be doing or whatever industry we might be associated with, because ultimately poetry is that form of expression which is owned by almost everybody. Because it is a medium to express your thoughts, your observations, and of course your emotion as well. Now, coming back to Wallace Stevens, his first poetry collection was called Harmonium, and it was published in 1923. And in fact, he has quite a few collections to his credit, and he wrote until the 1950s, right? So, that is the time, that is early 20th century, early to mid 20th century is the time when Wallace Stevens was writing. Now, some of his important poetry collections include, the first one is The Man and the Blue Guitar, which was published in 1937, The Auroras of Autumn, published in 1950, and his last collection of poems, that was called as Collected Poems, was published in 1954, and he also won the Pulitzer Prize in 1955 shortly before his death. So, here we have a Pulitzer Prize winning poet right, who got this award in the middle of the 20th century. But unfortunately, this was a very short time before he died. Now, you see, it's important for us when we understand a poet or a writer. I'm sure that a lot of you would also be, very curious that what were the influences of on that particular poet or writer. This is a question that always comes to mind, right? Who is it that inspired them? What is it that made them write? So if we talk about these questions in the context of Wallace Stevens, now one of the foremost things that we say is that while he was studying at Harvard University, he was under the tutelage of philosopher George Santayana. Now I'm sure you would have heard of this name, George Santayana. He's a very famous philosopher, and Wallace Stevens was under his tutelage. Further, he would also travel to Florida, and that is where he met two very important poets, that is Robert Frost and Ernest Hemingway. Both were the great poets of his time, right? So while he did interact with them and was also had an exchange with them, but at the same time he is also known to have entered into some kind of an altercation between Robert Frost and Ernest Hemingway. But what we notice is that how these great poets of the time were definitely in conversation and would exchange ideas, and these are some of the names that come to mind when it comes to Wallace Stevens. And in fact, there's always also been this other trend that whenever a great poet passes away, there are certain other poets of his time who write obituaries or maybe dedicate some poems to him. So likewise, even when Wallace Stevens passed away in 1954, another major poet of the day, that is William Carlos Williams, wrote the obituary for Stevens. Right? So this is one of the ways for the fellow poets to commemorate the work done by a particular individual and the contributions that they make in the industry of literature, right? So now if you see on your screens, now this is what Wallace Stevens looked like, and next, having looked at his biographical, primarily or broadly biographical details, the next thing which is very important for us to understand is his poetic craft, right? What is it that distinguished Wallace Stevens from maybe the other poets of the time, and for that matter, maybe poets who were before, who came before or after him? So the first thing that we say, talking of his poetic craft, is that Stevens belongs to the American modernism, right? That is the literary trend that he is associated with. But it's important for us to note that he interacts with the conventions of modernism very differently. I would say that is what also distinguishes Wallace Stevens as a poet as well. The way he, or the unique manner in which he positions himself as a modernist poet. Not that it was conscious, but when we study him in conjunction with American modernism, we understand that how there were quite a few departures in his poetry, departures from the standard conventions which defined modernism as a literary trend, right? Now, you would wonder that what are these departures? Where did Stevens, let's say, experiment or go beyond? One of the things that you would have noticed if you have read some bit of modernist poetry is that the language is somewhat abstract. If you think of poets such as Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, sometimes the sentence structure, the syntax, etc., it is not straightforward, it is not complete, and therefore has some sense of abstraction to them. And therefore it is, I would say that, for every student, when they read a modernist or a text of modernist poetry for the very first time, this is one challenge that they face. But quite on the contrary, in Wallace Stevens's poems, the language that he uses is very direct and straightforward, right? The second thing that we say about his poetic craft also is that the syntax of his poetry is such that there is no break in meaning or the flow of the idea in his poems. Now, this is a second important point. Now, you see, to give you a very quick backdrop of why are we talking about syntax. Now, you see, whenever we talk about modernist writing, one of the features is, its fragmented nature. Because, of course, modernism, as we all are aware, as a trend came up after the First World War, when the world was, undergoing massive upheaval. Everything that was believed to be true was called to question. There was complete chaos. It was difficult for people to make sense of anything. There was meaninglessness. They did not know where the future lies. That was the scale of widespread destruction, right? So at this point of time, when this had happened, this kind of an experience is then also artistically captured by the poets and the writers of the time. So therefore, one of the ways in which this experience filters into the literary text is through the fragmentation of, or the fragmented meaning or the fragmented syntax. There's a break in the flow. A lot of times you would notice in a given text. But again, when we look at Wallace Stevens' poems, this does not happen. There is no break in meaning or the flow of idea. Now, third, you see, as I just now mentioned, that classically, the modernist poems or the classic modernist poems drastically experiment to the extent of the verse slipping into abstractions. They experiment with form, they experiment with content, to the point that it is believed that sometimes, a modernist poetry then, veers into abstraction. But again, this is not the case with Wallace Stevens. His language is direct, the syntax is unbroken, right? Now, a fourth thing that we also say is that breaking away from the established trends was a hallmark of modernist aesthetics. It means that all that was believed to be true, or that was upheld, or that was followed up until that point of time was then questioned by in the modernist aesthetics, right? So this breaking away is an important part of the modernist aesthetic. But again, Stevens is not experimental to the point where meaning seems to collapse, right? So these are some of the things that we notice when we look at Wallace Stevens as a modernist poet, or when we compare his poetry to other modernist poets of the time. Now, the next thing that we say about his poetic craft is that he also was part of this sub-literary movement, or this movement which was a sub-trend under literary modernism, which was called as the Imagist movement, right? And so we notice that features of the Imagist movement then are evident in his poems. Now, what exactly was Imagism? Now, Imagism flourished in the 20s and is one of the many sub-trends under the literary modernism. And we see that, Imagism was characterized by the poet including sharp and direct images in his verses, each with a detailed visual description. Now, as the term itself suggests, right, Imagism, it's derived from the word image. So we notice that in modernist poetry, the poet would use images that were very sharp, that were very direct, and you would see an abundance of such images in poetry written under Imagism. And in fact, you will also notice this when we discuss Wallace Stevens's poem today, that is The Snowman. So keep that in mind, right? So along with very sharp and direct images, we see that there is a detailed visual description of whatever idea that the poet is trying to develop. He visualizes the thought in that sense in the poem, right? Third thing we also say is that the Imagist poems, then they have word pictures, right? Word pictures means that that the reader is made to visualize the exact scene or the object that is being described. And how is that visualization made possible? That is by means of words. So therefore we say that Imagist poems have word pictures, right? Now, who are some of the famous poets that along with Wallace Stevens, that are part of this sub-trend of literary modernism? We see Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams. Both of these seminal poets also subscribed to this trend, and in several of his early poems, Stevens does create such vivid word pictures or images. And in fact, the poem which is in discussion today is a classic example of this kind of poetry, where we notice, where we can see Stevens as the Imagist poet, right? Now, a third aspect of Wallace Stevens's poetic craft also is that his verses are steeped in philosophy, right? Now, if you remember that at the beginning of this lecture, we had discussed that how Wallace Stevens was actually inspired by George Santayana, who is a very famous philosopher, right? So therefore we see that his poetry has a very pronounced sense of philosophy. Now you might also wonder that how is that the case? Perhaps one may say that that was also the that is what even the modernist trend, or I would say that time after the World War, it was such that it made people engage with essential questions of life. In fact, for that matter, if you even think of Samuel Beckett, or who was of course writing later, which was around the 1960s, but other poets, authors and playwrights of the time, they engage with questions of being, questions which are philosophical in nature. Once again, it is bound to happen at a time when the experience of being alive was incredibly intense, right? Where there was so much of, I would say, strife all around. There was so much of clash, and things did not make sense. So, questions of being, death, life, etc., they became quite important for quite a few poets and writers of the time. So therefore we also see in Wallace Stevens's poetry philosophical ruminations about the questions of being, death, life, among others. You see, you will notice these themes appear in his poems. Now, to just give you a very small, I would say, a preview of or an idea, particularly of what do we mean by his philosophical inclinations. Now, there's this sentence from a very famous, another very famous poem by Wallace Stevens, and it's titled "The Emperor of Ice Cream." So, in this poem, there's a sentence where the poet says, "Let be the finale of seem," unquote. It's a very short sentence. Let be be the finale of seem. Now you see very clearly, we notice that the poet over here is drawing some kind of an opposition between being and seeming. What does it mean? By being, perhaps what he means is the reality, the actual, I would say, existence, while seem would mean perhaps the image or the assumption or the surface of what appears, or for that matter an appearance. So reality and appearance then seem to be posited against one another in this very short but at the same time very thought-provoking sentence by Wallace Stevens in his poem The Emperor of Ice Cream. So he says, let be the finale of seem. So he says that let appearance, while there are appearances in life, we all experience them, because as they say that too much of reality sometimes gets difficult to for us to confront. So there are appearances, but then he says that the finale of appearances, or the finale of seeming, must be being, that is in existence. So that is just to give you a flavor of what how Wallace Stevens would engage in such philosophical questions through his poetry. And one would also notice that in his poems then, for that matter, the style of writing, that is, or this genre per se, that is poetry, itself is such that it is suggestive. So imagine a form which is suggestive by nature, then has philosophical questions embedded in it. So you would notice that when you read Wallace Stevens's poetry, there is a lot to think about. You will have to read it multiple times in order to really start to unravel what actually the poet wishes to say, right? So I feel that with these points, your curiosity about Wallace Stevens's poems would have been piqued by now. But let's very quickly go over all the points that we've discussed. Foremost, we say that Wallace Stevens is a 20th century poet of the literary trend of American modernism. Second, we also discussed that how Wallace Stevens does important contribution, or he has made important contributions to American modernism as well. And at the same time, we also discussed that how there are certain important features which define his poetic craft as well. And what are these features? The first thing is that he or his works seem to be in a way a departure from the traditional conventions of modernism per se. And where do we see these points of departure? First, in the direct language. Second, there is no abstraction in meaning. Third, the syntax does not break, etc. Right? Then the second thing that we discussed about his poetic craft was that he is an Imagist poet. He belongs to the sub-trend of literary modernism, that is the Imagism, right? So that's the other important point that we notice about his poetic craft. And third, we also see that while he subscribed to this trend, but at the same time he also broke away from literary modernism. And of course, fourth, we discussed that how philosophy is quite central to the poetry of Wallace Stevens, right? So now with this biographical and intellectual background, in the next part of the lecture, we will discuss a poem by Wallace Stevens that is called The Snowman. Thank you.